Welcome to the Hockey Debates podcast. I'm Bob Duff. I'm joined by Kevin Allen, the esteemed Hall of Fame writer from USA Today, and also Art Regner from DetroitRedWings.com. We're going to talk about all things hockey today, and we're going to start, Art. The Red Wings are looking like a different team so far this year. You're close to them. What do you see that gives you confidence that this team can make a move and be a playoff contender this year?
Well, I think you just said it. I think it's confidence. I think what happened is that the younger players, certainly Mantha, Larkin, Athanasiou, and Bertuzzi, kind of realized. I kind of joke around that. I think they finally got it. That like Steve Yzerman and Nick Cromwell and Chris Draper and Sean Horkoff, none of them are coming down on the ice to help them out, and that I think they finally got it. I think experience too that this is their team. If they're going to do anything, these guys really have to carry the club. And not that they haven't. I know that they did last year a little bit, but I really think that is the difference. I think that they're more confident. I think that they believe in one another, and I think that goes a long way. I think they're all really good hockey players. I think that Anthony Mantha finally has, as I said, confidence. Tyler Bertuzzi does whatever it takes to get it done. And then obviously Dylan Larkin has a high motor. And I think as soon as Athanasiou gets his legs going after this injury, this little tweak that he had, I think that he'll be motoring too. But, defense is still really going to be a problem for this team.
Art, in watching this team, if I could be devil's advocate here, I think obviously their top line has been terrific. Their fourth line, I think, has contributed as well. But we're really seeing nothing from the second and third lines, and in particular Athanasiou, since he's come back, it doesn't seem like he's got the right mix to play with. Who do you see as the guy that can slot in there and play with Athanasiou to get that second line going?
I really think, Kevin, I'm not sure. I'm not trying to cop out here too. I'm almost thinking, and it'll be interesting to see what Jeff Blashill does, because I think they may elevate Athanasiou to that first line. And I think for a couple of reasons, it's because they don't have any secondary scoring, really. If you're relying on, Jacob De La Rose, Justin Abdicator, and Darren Helm to provide secondary scoring, and they've done a wonderful job. You're right; they're the fourth line. They'll even tell you, we might be in trouble. So I think that they're going to have to try to manufacture. I think to get Athanasiou going, and he's always wanted to play with Mantha and Larkin, and I don't know how Blash will break that up. But right now, Val Filppula has not picked up where he left off last year, 16 goals with the Islanders. Fonz Nielsen's been hurt, and he's coming back. So I think that secondary scoring, which has been an issue with this team, is going to continue to be an issue. I don't think there's an easy fix unless Michael Rasmussen, who's doing very, very well in Grand Rapids, and Philip Zadina can probably catch fire. Perhaps they need an influx of scoring. I think if you look at the current roster, besides the four guys that I mentioned, I'm not sure where that's going to come from. I mean, Tara Hirose is, I'm not going to say he's coming back down to earth, but he's not a scorer. He's the first one to tell you. He's a passer, and he's worked on his shot over the summer. So I think I think that's really a delicate balance right now, because I think you saw the last two games the Red Wings played against Toronto and Vancouver, that number one line, had the stuffings beat out of them. They were all over them. I mean, if you can shut down Detroit's number one line right now, you're going to win a hockey game, because they're not scoring any goals. Nobody else is scoring any goals.
I think another issue with teams that people would consider in the bottom third of the league, going 1 to 23, I don't think there's a significant difference between the top teams and the bottom teams for most part. But it's when you start getting those injuries, and the Wings are starting to get injuries now. DeKeyser's hurt. Nemeth is ill. He may not play tonight. You mentioned Nielsen was out. Daly was out. I mean, the Wings have a lot of young talent in Grand Rapids, but it's guys that probably aren't ready to fill roles in the NHL yet. So when they've got a deep dive into their minor league system when they have injuries, I think that's where you see the drop-off from the strongest teams to the weaker teams.
Well, I think you're right, Bob. I think we saw it last year when, 5 of their top 6 defensemen were out, and they were playing with basically a rookie defensive core, and they didn't win until their 8th game of the year. I think one thing too is I want to say Danny DeKeyser being out, and I know he gets a lot of flack from the fans, but he's a premier penalty killer. He adds a lot. He leads them in ice time, and I think you saw. I'm not sure, and I might be confused here, but Vancouver had didn't score a power play goal, I think, all season long, and they had 3 the other night. And one of the reasons why is because Danny DeKeyser's not in the lineup. He would be a huge loss, and I think that. It's a weird situation when you look at it. They got Alex Biega, and I know Steve wanted to add some veteran presence, and for the most part, I think he's made some really good moves. Madison Bowers seems to be a player that, when he's in there, seems to be okay, but there's something not clicking between him and Jeff right now, because I'm kind of wondering why Bowie isn't given more of a shot, but they think that he turns the puck over too much. He's too much of a risk taker, but from what I've seen and what he did in the preseason, I'm not so sure that he doesn't deserve a look.
Art, I want to take you back to Grand Rapids again and talk about the players that are there: Rasmussen, Zadina, Joe Veleno. All those players are players that I think the fan base is very excited about. But I looked at the statistics of the first 3 games, and it's way early and so forth. But Zadina obviously has been a little slower to develop than they had hoped for. And number one, what's your sort of impressions on him? Is there any reason to be concerned about that, or is he just a guy that's going to take some time to figure out how to score at this level? And is Rasmussen, he has 5 points, I think, in 3 games, 7 shots. Are the Red Wings, you think, close enough to at the point of perhaps bringing him up and giving him a shot to play on that second line on the wing?
Well, I think that it's really odd because in training camp, Jeff Blashill said that Rasmussen was going to be a center. Michael Rasmussen wants to be a center. And, looking ahead into the crystal ball here, we were projecting that, eventually Larkin's the top center. And then you would have Joe Veleno as the second center on the team. Rasmussen would be the third line center. And then, any combination like a Christopher End or perhaps a Chase Pearson, who's been pretty impressive, who was injured, but now is just called or reassigned to Grand Rapids today, that they were looking pretty good. I'm under the impression, based on what Steve said, unless the secondary scoring, which is, pretty pathetic right now, that I think Detroit wants to keep Rasmussen in Grand Rapids and let him learn the center position and be dominant in the AHL and then come up. Obviously that's a perfect case scenario. Zadina's another story. I had heard privately that the Red Wings, when they drafted him, they loved his shot. They fell in love with him. I know that, in his draft year, if they lost the Rasmus Dahlin sweepstakes, I remember every Red Wing official at that time privately, I said, well, if you lose Rasmus, who do you want? And without hesitation, every one of them said, hey, we want Philip Zadina. If we could get Philip Zadina, because they're looking for goal scoring. And then but they didn't think Zadina would be there. They were going to draft Evan Bouchard, who's now with the Edmonton Oilers. So I know that, especially when they played Vancouver with Quinn Hughes and the University of Michigan ties, people were saying, "Well, God, Quinn Hughes, like they should have drafted Quinn Hughes." Even if they didn't take Zadina, I know that they would have taken Evan Bouchard. So I guess, Kevin, in a roundabout way, getting back to Zadina, I think that the Red Wings were surprised at how he lacks quickness and speed. I think that was the thing that kind of shocked them, that I've heard, through the grapevine, and that, they thought that he could be able to create his own shot and he'd move to the corners. Now, I think at this point, and this is a bad comparison, and I'm not saying he's him, but I think they're hoping that he kind of learns the game like Brett Hall did. Brett Hall was not, as you guys know, fleet of skate by any stretch of the imagination, but he could, he could get open. He would. Brett Hall, I always wondered watching Brett Hall, because you forget he was on the ice, and the next thing you know, there'd be, where his shot is cranking in goals. And I think that at this point, they're hoping that the experience that Zadina gets in the AHL, where he learns how to play and figures the game out at that pro level because, you know, he's not – they just don't think he's going to be a speed merchant or have enough speed to, you know, maneuver around the ice. So Zadina, I'm not worried about him from this aspect. Is he's, you know, he's really a really good kid. He plays within himself. He understands. He doesn't brood. You know, he really tries, and he's going to try hard. So if it turns out that he is not the player that the Red Wings drafted at 6th overall, I won't think it will be a lack of effort on his part. It'll just be, you know, unfortunately, just one of those things that, you know, he reached a level where, you know, his skill set just didn't translate well.
Jeff Blashill always says he's just worried about the game tonight, but fortunately, we're not tied by those constraints, so we can look ahead. And what do you think that atmosphere and environment is going to be like when they go into Edmonton to face Ken Holland's Oilers? I mean, it just still seems weird to say that.
Well, it really does. I think that, you know, and I guess Edmonton has a new third alternate jersey they're going to debut on Friday. I would imagine that, you know, first of all, the Red Wings to a man revere Ken Holland. They absolutely just think the world of him. And I think that, you know, the Red Wings are going to be, I know they're playing tonight in Calgary, but I think they're going to be totally psyched to go against him and play against him. I mean, Edmonton's off to a pretty darn good start. I watched them last night, and I think it's going to be interesting because I know you gentlemen have talked to, you know, Kevin and Bob. You've talked to Ken Holland enough. It's still on occasion when you're talking to him and asking him a Red Wing question, he will still say "we" and catch himself and then start laughing a little bit and say, "Well, Detroit." So I just think it's going to be odd. I mean, I would expect that the Red Wings are going to put on a real good show and a real good effort. And I think that they're going to want to show, and this is a strange thing. I think, you know, when you're traded away from a team, you come back and you want to show that team that they made a mistake. I think the Red Wings are going to be playing to show Ken Holland that he didn't make a mistake drafting them and putting them on the Detroit roster. That, you know, in essence, Ken Holland's team is going to be wearing red and white on Friday. It's not going to be the Edmonton Oilers, although, you know, trust me, he's saying his rosary every day for Connor McDavid and Draisaitl. I mean, he's pretty doggone happy, but you know, that's going to be an interesting dynamic. I think that, you know, and you know, I'm not going to go as far as to say if the Red Wings win that game on Friday, Ken Holland will, you know, feel validated and say, yeah, that's my boys. I mean, that's not going to happen. You know, obviously this is the NHL, but I think in a way, I think the Red Wings are going to be playing for Ken Holland in that game. It's as strange as that sounds.
Art, we'll let you go now, but before you go, we're going to start talking about the greatest player in NHL history. We're going to debate that a little bit, and I just want to get your thought. Obviously, we're talking about Wayne Gretzky versus Bobby Orr versus the great Gordie Howe, and I'm guessing I know the answer to that, who you think it is, but let me hear what you have to say about it.
Well, I will tell you, you know, in my lifetime, I still think the best hockey player I've ever seen, and I was, you know, a little boy, was Bobby Orr. Just the way he transformed the game and end-to-end rushes, and I just thought it was wonderful. But, you know, I mean, you know, my birth certificate says Detroit, Michigan, and, you know, and talking to Wayne Gretzky over the years, you know, Scotty Bowman. I think the dynamic that Gordie brought in a 6-team league and the way that he was dominant and could do it all, you know, I'm gonna go with the hometown guy. I'm going with Gordie Howe.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Art. Thanks for joining us on our podcast, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you up the road.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. As you know, I admire both of you. You guys are two of the best, not only hockey journalists, but journalists that I've ever met. And keep up the good work. It's always a pleasure. You're great friends of mine, and I really enjoy any time I can talk hockey with Robert Duff and Kevin Allen.
All right, thanks, Art.
Thanks a lot, Art. Talk to you soon.
My pleasure.
All right. So, Kevin, the greatest player in hockey history in your mind is who?
Well, it's Gordie, and I have the same birth certificate problem that Art has, and obviously I saw Gordy early in his career, and I'm old enough to have watched him for throughout the 60s and 70s, and I also covered Wayne Gretzky. I covered Bobby Orr. I also remember I didn't cover Bobby Orr. I covered Mario Lemieux. I think at least has to have a mention in this for a reason that I'll explain shortly. And I, of course, know and watched Bobby Orr as a young fan. And this is the way I break it down. I see it as Gordie Howe was the best all-around player of that group. He added a physical element to the game when he played that the other people that we've talked about, didn't really add. And Bobby Orr could be a fighter, but that really wasn't the game. He didn't play that style. Gordie did play that style. He was a ruthless player. He was a guy that, made you pay to make a play. And then, just getting back, I thought Lemieux was the best goal scorer I ever saw in terms of just the pure talent. Like, nobody was better on a breakaway, in my opinion, than Mario Lemieux. I've never seen a player that was good one-on-one. He just had so many different moves and ways to drive the puck in. I don't think anyone changed the game the way that Bobby Orr did. I don't think there's any question about that. He was a guy that he revolutionized the game. We just didn't look at puck-moving defensemen the same way until Bobby Orr came around. And, of course, Wayne Gretzky was simply probably the greatest genius of the game, the smartest player. He was a guy that used everything on the ice, including, the net itself. Like, nobody, thought about using the net to set up plays the way that Wayne did by going in Wayne's office, which was behind the net. He just thought the game differently. It's almost like he had a photographic memory. He knew where everyone is on the ice. But saying all that, I just think he being Gordie Howe was the greatest player simply because he just did absolutely everything possible.
Yeah, he could be your tough guy. He could be your goal scorer. He could be your checker. He could be your playmaker. And often when the Red Wings were stuck with injuries on the blue line, he dropped back and played defense. There's the famous quote from Frank Selke, the old Montreal Canadiens GM, that the only thing Gordie Howe couldn't do was sit on the bench. And I'm not tied by a birth certificate from Detroit, Michigan, like you and Art. I came from the Toronto area, and yet Gordie Howe to me is always going to be the greatest player that ever played for those reasons. And people always ask me, what do I think his greatest accomplishment was? And I always say he scored 16 goals in the NHL at the age of 51. And I did a study last year. I took Howe's point totals from his final NHL season in 1979-80. He actually turned 52 during the season. He scored 16 goals and 25 assists that year. I put that into last season's stats and checked every team. And on the vast majority of teams in Gordie had played last season and put those numbers up, he'd have been in the top 5 and in the top 10 on every team, but in the top 5 in scoring on most NHL teams last season. So to me, that's an astonishing accomplishment.
Yeah, I mean, his numbers and, the stories, there's anecdotal evidence and there's statistical evidence about his greatness. But here's a couple of things I wanted to mention, because we forget sometimes. He won 6 Hart trophies and 6 Art Ross trophies. He suffered a fractured skull, and, of course, he had brain swelling during the 50-51 playoffs. And then it's forgotten that the following year he came back and won the NHL scoring championship after going through all that. He registered 103 points in the season where he turned 40 years old. I mean, and that was, obviously a time when 100 points was fairly significant. It wasn't the 1980s. He played in 29 All-Star games and 32 professional seasons. And, of course, as you mentioned, Bob, he scored his last goal at 52. And, as an older guy, I know you can actually get your, have your AARP card now. At the time he was playing in the NHL. Of course, he had, the great fight with Lou Fontinato, who was considered the toughest guy in the league at the time. So that sort of proved his toughness. And then in the 1960s, I found a story where they brought some experts, physics and mathematics, and they estimated that Gordie Howe's wrist shot was at over 100 miles an hour in the 1960s. That was prior to the composite sticks that we have today in the technology that makes these sticks produce shots that are much harder. He was using a standard, probably a Northland, don't you think, Bob? Wooden stick. And of course, and this is the one too, and I think is very remarkable. Not only did he play 26 NHL seasons, but he played in 90% of his games from 61 to 1970, a period of 9 years. He only missed 2 games. Like, he was remarkably durable for a guy that was really played a very physical game. And of course, you know, defensemen were all over him because he was the top player. So, all those players that we mentioned, you know, Bobby Orr was just such a remarkable game-changing impact player. And I loved covering Lemieux. I just thought he was so incredible. And Wayne Gretzky was great as well. And the two factors, I think, that separate Gretzky, because I think Gretzky's right there next to Gordy. But the factors that separate those two from the other two are the ambassadorship. Like, Wayne Gretzky was a great ambassador for the game, and part of that he learned from Gordie Howe. You know, his dad has sort of schooled him on the way Gordie sort of made it his business to kind of sell the sport of hockey. That he knew, he being Gordie, knew that the game needed to be sold in America, and he never turned away an opportunity to kind of sell the game. And I think Gordie was like that as well. So I think it's a difficult call for some, but not for me. I have it, you know, Gordie is number 1, Wayne Gretzky number 2, Bobby 3, and Mario 4 is how I rate those. But I do think it's kind of a 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D type arrangement. I think you'd be pretty thrilled to have any 4 of those guys, any one of those 4.
Yeah, and you mentioned the durability. In fact, going into his last season with the Red Wings in 70-71, in his 40s, he entered that season with the second longest active consecutive games played streak in the NHL. He's playing against all these guys, some of them 20 years younger than him, and he's the guy that plays every night.
Yeah, and such a ruthless guy. Like, I've talked to Mark Howe, his son, about him, and he said that, first of all, Gordie could tell you after he cut a guy how many stitches the guy would need, number 1, which I've always found kind of remarkable. He'd get back on the bench and he'd say, you know, that was a 20-stitch cut. And the other thing is just, like, Mark used to complain that in the WHA, Gordie always took it upon himself to protect his sons. And he said the impact of Gordie coming in to hit the guy who hit them usually caused greater damage or was of greater force than they were hit the original time. So Gordie would come in at 100 miles an hour after Mark would, you know, having been hit, and Gordie would come in to sort of protect him because, you know, at that point Mark was still a teenager, and he said that force was even greater. And almost everybody that played in the original 6 days talked about Gordie's insistence on getting even, and sometimes it would take several years before he would make you pay that price that he felt you owed. But he always came back and got you. And they also talked about how, you know, you went into a corner and he just was remarkable in his ability to hurt you without incurring a penalty. He just knew how to do it so that the refs wouldn't know.
Marcel Pronovo told me the worst injury he ever suffered was while he was playing for the Red Wings, and it was delivered by Gordie Howe. It was back in those days when they used the defensemen to take defensive zone faceoffs because they were generally the biggest, strongest guys on the ice. So they figured at worst they would tie a draw in the defensive zone situation. So Marcel's getting ready to take a draw against Montreal, and Gordie comes over to him before he goes into the dot and says, "After you win the draw, get out of the way." Because Bert Olmsted was taking the draw for Montreal, and Bert had wronged Gordie, and Gordie decided that was the moment to even the score. And he said he would be coming. And so, as it turned out, they kind of got tangled up fighting for the puck. Marcel couldn't get out of the way. When Gordie came in with the freight train, he hit Marcel as hard as he hit Olmsted and broke Marcel's collarbone.
Yeah. Well, the Bobby Hall used to say that Gordie Howe was tougher than a night in jail, which was one of my favorite quotes. And he also, Bobby Hall told me more than once that and I think this is such a remarkable testimony, but he said that his dad favorite player was not him; it was Gordie. He said he always paid more attention to what Gordie Howe was doing, and he said he always told me that I needed to act like Gordie Howe, you know, kind of away from the game. And I would also tell you that Wayne Gretzky has told me and many others that he thinks Gordie Howe is the greatest player of all time. So, and I think Wayne's a pretty good judge, given the fact that he's right there with Gordie.
You mentioned who their favorite players were. Sid Abel telling a story about leaving for the rink one day, and Sid Abel, captain of the Red Wings, pretty famous Red Wing in his own right. He's walking out to the car, and his kid's playing road hockey with some of his buddies, and and you're a kid, and you say, I'm so and so, I'm so and so, and they're all yelling out who they are. And Sid Abel's son says, "I'm Gordie Howe."
Well, I often remember the late Max McNabb telling me about when he talked about his career in the NHL, which wasn't very long, but he said he spent 20 games during when Sid Abel was injured, centering Howe and Lindsay. And he said what that really meant is I watched the puck whiz across in front of me between Ted Lindsay and Gordie Howe. He said, when I was playing center for them, it was really a two-man line, and I was just doing kind of the back checking. Those two had such great chemistry. And, I mean, obviously, Gordie Howe proved that he could score with anybody, but I think when playing with Ted Lindsay, that was that was a great match and a great connection. And it's funny because it's usually, obviously, it's always usually a center and a wing, but in that case, I think the two wings were stronger. Sid Abel was a top player in his own right, but not to the level I don't think that Lindsay and Howe were players. I think Sid Abel did, from what I understand. Obviously, that was before my time, although that's hard to believe, but it was. But he did a lot of the defensive work on that line. Have you heard that as well?
Yeah, I've often read where he said those two kind of carried him, and he was toward the end of his career, and playing with those two made his life a lot easier. Tommy Webster told me his rookie season was Gordie's last season with the Red Wings, and they ruined him, as they would often do. They would ruin the rookies with Gordie to kind of learn from the master. And he said he couldn't sleep because he said, I'd just be nodding off to sleep, and I'd roll over and I'd go, holy smokes, that's Gordie Howe in the other bed.
Well, speaking of old-time hockey players, I know you wanted to say a few words about Ted Green, who passed away recently, the former NHL defenseman. And then, I got to know him as an assistant coach, in the National Hockey League. He was a tough player, Bob, but a very funny guy and a very kind of a nice guy. He's he was like the typical, rough and tumble player who off the ice was pretty nice.
He's one, he, much like Johnny Busick, had suffered through all those lean years in Boston in the 60s when they finished last virtually every season. And then finally get rewarded at the end of his NHL days with a couple of Stanley Cups. It had to be just a wonderful feeling. Of course, didn't get to play in the first one, much like you mentioned. Gordie missed the one playoff with his fractured skull. Ted Green, missed an entire season when he suffered a fractured skull in a preseason stick skiing episode with Wayne Mackey in 1969. And missed the whole 69-70 season, and the Bruins won the cup, but came back amazingly because people didn't think he was going to survive at first, and certainly there was doubts whether he'd ever play again. And came back and played and won a cup with the Bruins in 72, and then went to the WHA and won several Avco Cup championships playing in the WHA with the Whalers and the Jets.
I saw Bobby Orr was quoted. They resurrected some old quotes about Ted Green, and Bobby Orr at one point said he was the toughest player he ever played with or against. As I said, very, very funny guy as well. He's famous for the fact that, why don't you tell the story about Sean Van Allen?
Sean Van Allen, who was a player with the Oilers when Ted was coaching the Oilers, he got a concussion, and this was in the days before they really took concussions all that seriously. They took him to the hospital because he was out cold, and he came to, and between periods, they were in touch with the Oilers media director had gone to the hospital with Van Allen, and they're talking on the phone, and Green says, well, how's he doing? And the guy on the other end says, well, he's awake, but he's not sure who he is. And Green says, well, tell him he's Gretzky and get him back here.
That was Ted. He was famous for the one-liners. Always well liked by the players. He was the the kind of assistant coach the players love. He was the buffer between, in Edmonton, he was the buffer between Sather and the players. He was the kind of assistant coach that every player could go to and felt like he was on his side. But Bob, before we wrap it up, I wanted to ask you too. I know we're only just into the NHL season, but already we have some teams that are struggling. And always at this time of year, we see the odds that come out of the betting parlors, the sports books, about who is going to be the first coach fired. So my question to you is, as I look at a winless New Jersey Devils team, how much trouble is John Hines in? If you had to lay odds, is he the guy that's most likely to be fired? I mean, already we are seeing Tom Fitzgerald, the assistant GM, is going down behind the bench to be with him. Is that a sign that John Hines is in trouble?
I think so, because there was obviously high expectations that New Jersey would turn it around, and they were a playoff team 2 seasons ago. Last year they fell out again. They go out and they get PK Subban, a Norris Trophy winning defenseman. They win the lottery and get Jack Hughes. They've already got Nico Hischier. They've got a Hart Trophy winner in Taylor Hall. This team should be better than they are. And it's not a case of, that a young team that's still learning how to win. 2 years ago they showed they knew how to win. They regressed last year, so he's given another shot because they made the playoffs. But now if they continue on this path in the wrong direction, I think he's in serious trouble.
Yeah, traditionally Ray Shero has been a loyal general manager to his coaches, and in Pittsburgh, if you remember, he didn't fire Dan Bylsma, and he got fired at the same time with Dan Bylsma. And I know he's a big proponent of John Hines. It's not like Hines forgot how to coach. I mean, we all viewed him as a very as a strong coach, up until this season when they've gotten out of the gate. So I don't know. The one element here that I think you have to factor in is ownership. I think the owners here are involved. They want to turn this around. I think they're looking for a quicker rise, and for that reason, Ray Shero could be under some pressure to make a move here. So, the one thing I would add is that sometimes we forget, because we've had players like Jack Eichel and Austin Matthews who have come in and made instant impacts, that doesn't happen every year. That the top draft picks, like I thought the expectations for Jack Hughes were a little strong. I mean, he's going to be a superior player, but it may take him some time. And I don't think it's totally outrageous that he doesn't have a point yet. I think it just speaks to the fact that, he wasn't quite as ready as Austin Matthews and Jack Eichel and the players that do make an impact. So I think, he'll figure this game out at some point, and then this team will be a little bit better. But in the interim, I think it's 50-50 that John Hines will last as coach of the New Jersey Devils. Anyway, I appreciate everyone joining us on this podcast. Look for us every Monday and Thursday, probably. At least that's the original plan. And we appreciate you joining Bob, Duff, and I on this cast.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.